Welcome back to the final video in the Risk Assessment series. I'm Jamie Miller, Registered SQF Consultant at Kellerman Consulting. Kellerman Consulting releases weekly training videos and important tips and strategies to help companies keep up to date with the latest food safety regulations. In this series, we discussed how to perform, document, and implement risk assessments in a facility, and how to review those assessments as part of operations and food safety programs. For the final episode of this series, we will discuss the risk assessment requirements in major GFSI schemes: SQF, BRCGS, FSSC 22000, and PrimusGFS. GFSI is the acronym for the Global Food Safety Initiative, which is a private, international organization that publishes benchmarking requirements for the food safety certification programs to adopt. Since all food safety programs must have basic controls over the safety of food or food packaging produced, each of the major GFSI schemes require risk-based decision-making as part of the programs, which should include risk assessments presented at the audit. Facilities preparing for a certification or recertification audit, review of existing risk assessments as well as creation of risk assessments where gaps exist should be scheduled. Even at the level of a GFSI certification scheme, risk assessments do not have a required format, so how a facility chooses to format and document the risk assessment is not prescribed. If you have not done so already, please download the free risk assessment tool from Kellerman Consulting to help guide you through performing and documenting your risk assessment. When we look at SQF, there are two main applications of risk assessments. The first application is the list of 8 required risk assessments found in the code. The second application of risk assessment is the act of trying to exempt GMP module requirements where they do not apply to the facility under audit. In all of the required risk assessments for SQF, they must be documented and reviewed by the SQF practitioner or the backup SQF practitioner, and must be reviewed as part of the SQF program during the internal audit, the review of the safety program, and by senior management at least every year. The SQF practitioner and the backup practitioner are expected to have undergone food safety training through a HACCP training course, as well as a PCQI training course for FDA-regulated facilities. So let's start by looking at the required risk assessments, and then we will discuss how to use risk assessments in situations of exemption. The first risk assessment required in the SQF code is found in section 2.3 and is for suppliers and service providers, which we covered in our video series on supply chain programs. Additionally, required assessments are found in section 2.4.8 for environmental swabbing programs for the site security in 2.7, allergen control program in section 2.8 for the piping of water, steam, ingredients, and waste in section 11.1.2, for employee clothing in section 11.3.3, for water and air and gases testing frequency in section 11.5, and for temporary storage in section 11.6.1. That is 7 total risk assessments, so if you are preparing for an SQF program, please make sure that the 7 required risk assessments you have planned to have at least those that apply to the facility completed prior to audit. Beyond the risk assessments we just listed, the SQF code makes a statement in section 2.4.2 that any of the GMPs found in the SQF module may be exempted through risk assessment. Now, in theory, you could not have a GMP program and instead only have a series of 20 or so risk assessments exempting operations, but that is not a realistic approach. We recommend implementing a documented GMP program as part of an SQF system. But with that in mind, as a facility reads the clauses of the GMP module and cannot picture how the facility will comply with required action, remembering to perform a documented risk assessment explaining why you cannot or should not comply with a specific requirement is a legitimate way to address it. Similarly, an auditor can request or demand a risk assessment for any activity they see during an audit, and if they state that a risk assessment is required, It is based on Section 2.4.2 of the SQF code. An example of this would be performing packaging operations in a place in a warehouse that is usually a storage or staging area. When activities are performed outside of a production area, usually it is done because of limited space or logistical problems moving materials into a production area. Without a risk assessment, packaging outside of a production area is likely to result in a major or minor nonconformance finding in an audit against the Separation of Functions Section 11.6, Materials Handling. We mentioned that overflow storage requires a risk assessment, but here it would be overflow production, with a documented risk assessment explaining how the facility makes sure the storage activities are halted during this overflow production, why the activity is not a risk to materials in the warehouse area, and documenting the supporting checks that make sure it is safe should generally be good enough to allow that activity without any finding. The BRCGS Issue 8 has many risk assessment requirements for operation, and this is one of the major differences between BRC and other GFSI programs such as SQF. Where SQF has 8 required risk assessments and a statement that more can be used to exempt operations, BRC takes a more prescriptive approach and does not generally use risk assessments to exempt programs. Instead, there are at least 15 required risk assessments, and they all address each of the major areas of the BRC standard. The first and most important risk assessment in a BRC program is a documented determination of risk level using the decision tree on pages 93 and 94 of the BRCGS code. The risk levels are low risk, high care, ambient high care, and high risk. The reasoning for the risk level and controls in place based on the risk level should be presented at the beginning of a BRC audit. Beyond the determination of risk assessments are required for internal audit and GMP inspection frequency, supplier and service provider approval, water testing, changing areas that are not dedicated rooms, foreign object detention and removal, cleaning and sanitation, frequency of validation of CIP equipment, environmental monitoring frequency, pest monitoring frequency, potential contamination from storage facilities, allergens, shelf life testing, and calibration. That is a lot of risk assessments, and the auditors expect each of those risk assessments to be reviewed yearly as part of the HACCP review and as part of the senior management review process, which is done at least every year. In addition to the importance of the risk level assessment document, BRCGS generally elevates foreign material controls as a key safety measure, and we recommend that the risk assessments performed on the foreign materials controls, such as metal detection, X-ray, optical sorting, filters and membranes, are detailed and use a longer format. Other risk assessments for BRCGS may be shorter in length. In an FSSC 22000 program, the ISO 22000 manual and ISO 22002 prerequisite program are far less prescriptive than SQF and BRC, which means that risk assessments are not required by the code on the one hand, but are very useful in showing the auditor how the facility decided to take the approach towards meeting the requirements, and so a facility can have dozens if they'd like. In fact, the ISO 22000 manual only requires risk to be specifically addressed in Section 6.1, which addresses risks and opportunities sections of the code. This risk assessment should be used as part of the food safety management system for the facility and should cover at least the main objectives for the facility in meeting customer expectations. We also strongly recommend that a risk assessment be performed for external communication and internal communication in the facility, and when this is performed, we are assessing the risk that required information is correctly communicated to suppliers, regulators, customers, and stakeholders, and then a separate risk assessment is performed for internal training, work instructions, and other employee interactions. The ISO 22002 technical specification requires risk assessments only for supplier approval and food defense, But again, for every program in an FSSC 22000 system, the requirements from the code are very general, and the more risk assessment used to explain why programs are handled in the manner chosen by the facility, the stronger the case that can be made to the auditor that these are acceptable. For agricultural programs undergoing PrimusGFS audit, there are 5 main areas where risk assessments should be documented. Required risk assessments are found for supplier approval in 1.06 of Module 1, for food defense in 1.08 of Module 1, and again in the inner modules. Additionally, fecal matter and water found in the inner modules, where livestock is present next to the farm, water usage on the farm, pesticide usage, cleaning, and re-entry intervals on the farm. Also, for the indoor warehouse module, a risk assessment of protective clothing should be performed. For all of the GFSI schemes I've spoken of, our viewers must take into account that our videos do not directly address all aspects of SQF, BRCGS, FSSC 22000, or PrimusGFS requirements for risk assessments. Please do not rely solely on our recommendations in this video, and make sure your program references and complies with the standards from the most current versions of the GFSI code in your facility in preparation for your audit. To learn more, visit our website and you'll find a full library of food safety training videos and resources. Follow us on LinkedIn and click the bell to be notified of new resources as they are released each week.